Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from LMNO and Flavor Caprice, a collaboration album, Bronze Age. So I've talked a little bit in the past about artists who just put out an incredible amount of material in a very short time. Now sometimes it's because the artist is just a creative genius who's going to go off in so many different directions that his material has to be maintained on different projects, on so many different areas, and it still can maintain that level of quality. Hey, it's rare, but it does happen. Sometimes it's a method for artists just to get out of label obligations quickly by flooding the market. Or sometimes it's a case of artists who have a knack for flooding the market with filler. And if that happens to get popular, well, I guess all the better for them. But in the case of hip-hop artists, it can be a little bit different, especially if you look in the underground. For one, there's the entire mixtape scene, where some artists continuously feed entire full-length projects to a hungry audience, practically for free. Or this is the case where they do special collaboration projects with very specific producers. It might barely be a full-length project, but at the same time, it might end up turning into something really special along the way. Hell, look at Freddie Gibbs and Madlib teaming up for Pinata. It was one of the best albums of 2014, I highly recommend it. And then there's LMNO, who I even think pushed the limit a little bit for this sort of thing. I've talked about him a couple times on this show, and it was less than a year ago when I reviewed his textured and well-written and yet slightly dreary and meandering record Pre-Paranoia. LMNO has a reputation for pumping out a lot of material. While he tends to be a very strong MC in terms of putting together potent, incredibly well-structured rhymes, his dry monotone and taste for some dustier old-school production means that some of his projects can start to run together, at least when you look across his entire discography. And yet, believe it or not, I was actually a little bit excited for this upcoming project with emergent producer Flavor Caprice. This has been a project 3 years in the making, supposedly, which seemed to imply that this was something in which LMNO would put a little bit more care and time into. And I figured I might as well get a dose of solidly dense lyrical hip-hop before checking out A$AP Rocky, because I'm not going to get it there. So how did Bronze Age turn out? Well, like with Pre-Paranoia, I did like Bronze Age, but I'm not sure it's LMNO's best effort. I think it would ultimately have more replay value than Pre-Paranoia, if only because of the production and more thought-provoking material that did land more impact with me, but it feels more scattershot than ever and just as meandering. More of a showcase for Flavor Caprice's production and sampling than LMNO's intricate bars. In other words, it's not better than After the Fact, the project he did with Evidence, but it does show more signs of where LMNO could take his material in the future, perhaps more than even he realized. Now, I should explain this, so let's get the easy positives out of the way first that you all should know. By now, I've talked about LMNO a couple times before. His methodical, hushed rasp that can ride across nearly any beat that at best feels conspiratorial or ragged, and that's where feels just a little bit, well, dry or monotone. I'm happy to say that for most of this record, LMNO does show off more dramatic range. His delivery is still dry, but it does show more of an ease and some emotional range behind the microphone, thanks to injecting his presence with a little bit more energy. It does help a little bit that collaborator on a couple songs, Mr. Brady's deeper tone, falls even more into this dry, monotone style, which gives LMNO the benefit of contrast. His higher tone just comes across as lighter and more effective. And I've always liked this guy's wordplay. Multi-layered rhymes that flow extremely well from bar to bar. This guy's a natural poet and technical wordsmith. He's incredibly strong. Although I'd argue by the end of the album, the bars feel a little bit more disconnected and staccato than they normally do. The punchline's not always having the same impact, at least for me. Now, to some extent, that disconnected feel might tie somewhat into the production from Flavor Caprice, which might be the most off-kilter, sample-heavy, and varied production LMNO has gone over in a while. To make a parallel, Flavor Caprice seems to have the most in common with, say, Madlib's brand of lo-fi, sample-heavy production. But the samples he chooses are less flashy than the soulful blaxploitation collection that Madlib usually has. It puts me more in the mind of, say, Bombay's work with Blue on Good to Be Home from last year, albeit with a lot better mix balance than that record had. I do wish, like Good to Be Home, the beats had been thickened a little bit more to give this record a little bit more driving punch to it. But you know what, on some level it kind of works, given the hazy, funky, almost pseudo-psychedelic vibe that this album can cultivate. And this record really lands some potent moments when the melody gets a little bit more prominence to back up those great bass lines, like on the harmonica-like progression of the title track, the fragmented guitar echoes on Rooftop, the wonky guitar against the horns and the hand claps on Eye to Eye, that great funky hook on Fast and Slow, those eerie sort of pianos against the swells of strings on Be Here Now, or the creeping, borderline aerial Pink-esque production on Lingo. I think my favorite moments, though, they came on the breezy Cali days, even despite the pitch-shifted sample, which isn't normally my thing. Done well here, though. Or the fairly lightweight subject matter, it's just a great song for chilling out to. Or the lo-fi bombast of Touchdown, the latter which is anchored by this great football commentator Resonator sample that really drives the track home for me. Great song. That's one element I really do love about Flavor Caprice's production, his choice of sampling. From the psychedelic poster reader sample on the title track, to the anthropology lecture on Rooftop, the interview on Fast and Slow. His material seems pulled from the fading embers of 60s psychedelia, forgotten educational videos, or old telecasts, which does a lot to add a lot of potent, organic, weathered feel that really does fit with that lo-fi presentation. Comes together really well. Now, that's not saying there aren't areas where things kind of slip up a little bit. The melodies on Ticker Tape and Good and Bye are barely audible, buried near the back of the mix, and the borderline chiptune progressions on Big Up feel completely out of place in terms of production style and tone with the rest of the record. On top of being really kind of an odd choice for LMNO's flow, I don't think I've heard him over that sort of production. I'm not sure I like it. I do think that sound could work for him in more of an open Mike Eagle sort of aim, but it needs to be a lot rougher and grittier to really flow with his voice. But now we need to talk about lyrics and themes. And on first glimpse, it might seem like LMNO's material is more abstract and scattershot than ever. Seriously, this album took a lot for me to really decode and uncover. Coupled with a shorter track length, it feels like we're getting nuggets of potential brilliance, but are held in such dense construction that it's really hard to explain and articulate. Eventually, around the 7th or 8th listen, I finally managed to get something out of it. It did kind of come together thematically, and yet on some level it's a little bit frustrating because it feels like we're touching on a lot of themes that he already explored to a fair bit on Pre-Paranoia, swapping out the conspiracy theories for apocalyptic despondence. Like on previous records, he's got his fair share of shots against the lies of the music industry and how it just eats up commercial artists. One of the running metaphors of this record, the embrace of psychedelic mind-expanding drugs like LSD or pot over hard drugs like cocaine and heroin that simply give an easy high, which has got an easy parallel with the music industry. And yet, this time on tracks like Do the Dance, he does show some empathy for the situations of those commercial artists, even though that's hard for him, and does a lot more to sell that tough road of independence and show why it's actually worthwhile as an artist, like on Fast and Slow. And what I find fascinating about this record is that it's less confrontational than you might think. He acknowledges on some tracks like Eye to Eye that some successful rappers in the mainstream barely have the essential skills to get by, but he pairs it with the musings on the pointlessness of picking a fight on Struggle on tracks like Double O. On some level, it really does feel pulled straight from the very late 60s and early 70s, the death of the hippie era and enlightenment, unless you choose to follow a lonely, less popular path that might leave you out of step with time, much to some extent like LMNO himself, who some probably would deem a throwback. Now, on some level, he gets all that, and he's fine with it. With songs like Be Here Now return to a vegan food metaphor that he's touched on before with Pre-Paranoia's Breakaways, but he does a lot more here to really expand it. Really good song. Perhaps just like the psychedelic poster reader, he's just ahead of his time rather than behind it. What he's also aware of is that the mainstream might come to the same understanding he has, but that might require destruction to get there. The signal fire letting the tribe know that the land is completely tapped out, the market is completely saturated. And that's one of the reasons that that sample, the football victory broken by the news of John Lennon's death, is such a powerful moment on this record. The reporter realizes for a split second that the game that he's commenting on is irrelevant. A complicated figure of hippie dreams and real idealism in the culture had been killed, and for a second the enormity just pierces through and really has an impact with him and wonders why the games are even relevant. And you know what? If the album had pushed deeper into these themes, we could be looking at one of my favorite hip-hop records of the year. Unfortunately, most of this record only brushes against these themes, so that the back half of the album feels increasingly fragmented with a lot of disconnected bragging and disconnected from the themes. It doesn't help matters that most of these tracks feel a little bit underwritten and short, or left to just fade into samples that are good, but I would like to hear more actual rapping. It's not even that it lost energy or ideas, it just doesn't have those moments of cohesion to really drive the points home. Sort of a similar problem with Pre-Paranoia. It brushes up against making really powerful arguments, but it never really quite completes them. As such, for me, I was not quite as underwhelmed as I was with Pre-Paranoia, which really hasn't aged well for me, but I do think that Bronze Age is not quite LMNO's best. For me, I'm thinking a 7 out of 10 in recommendation, particularly if you're looking for some really dense lyrical hip-hop to really decode, juxtaposed with some pretty interesting production. There are definitely highlights for me, the title track, Be Here Now, and especially Touchdown, that really got to me, but I think I'm still waiting for LMNO to match his work with evidence on After the Fact, or go beyond it. Even though this record told me anything, if it did, even after the many records LMNO has released, he's still got gas in the tank. He's got ideas to get there, and I'm looking forward to hearing them. So check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'll be happy to give them a listen. Yes, I'm going to be covering A$AP Rocky. Just give me some time here, folks. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.